Welcome, everybody, once again. 3:10 is a pretty good start time, I think, for a 3 o'clock meeting. So thank you all for coming. Most of you have been here a few times, and it's always a pleasure to see you. It's been a while since we had one of our discussions, but we're delighted that Toby has kicked off the proceedings once again, flown over to join us from London. Toby's our senior consulting fellow for the Middle East. He works for this office, but he's based in London, which serves to bolster our global credentials. Toby, of course, he's passed me a note here, giving his background, a rather modest one, suggesting he's worked all of his career on the politics of Iraq. But of course, he doesn't say that he's probably one of the foremost experts in the world on Iraq. So we're very lucky to have him, and lucky to pick his brains today. He's recently been working for General Petraeus on his policy team. So we'll be able to answer military questions as well as a lot of political ones.
Right, thank you very much. I think my colleague Mark Ellerman accused me of wearing too many hats. So the hat that I have on today is very much the role that I as the fellow for Middle East for the Middle East at the Institute. But what I want to do today is kind of ground the talk in the assumption, a brave assumption, but I think probably a pretty good one about the American departure at the end of the year, or it may well be fudged, but if we take that as the point of departure, I want to look at the Iraqi military, which I think broadly, with caveats, is a good news story, then move on to Iraqi politics, and we can see some good news there, but some profound problems. Look at the current wave of violence dominating especially Baghdad. Nuri al-Maliki, the Prime Minister, the ramifications of the Arab Spring's arrival in the Kurdish regional government in Erbil and Sulaymaniyah and in Baghdad, and then a couple of problems for the future. But first, obviously, I want to thank Eleanor and Mark for facilitating this talk, and as always, making me very comfortable in this wonderful office. I often look out the window at the view and at Manama and wonder why I'm working in London and not in Bahrain. Right, so I think as we all know, or we should know, the Status of Forces Agreement negotiated between the Iraqi government and the dying days of the Bush administration is a wonderfully unambiguous document. It pulled all American troops out of major Iraqi cities and towns in June 2009. Then it stopped their active combat operations in August 2010. And I can't remember the wording off the top of my head, but it says something like, the Status of Force Agreement says all US forces will be removed from all Iraqi territory, land, sea and air by the 31st of December 2011. Now, obviously, that rapidly approaching date, much the same as standing in front of an oncoming express train, is focusing minds in both Washington and Baghdad. Robert Gates, the soon-to-be departed Secretary of Defense, has made it very clear that although they want to reduce US troops from 47,000, he would like between 8,000 and 15,000 US troops on the ground. The ever-ambiguous Prime Minister Nuri al-Maliki has said that if the Iraqi parliament votes in favor of renegotiating the Status of Forces Agreement, agrees that some number of Iraqi troops can stay, well, that's all right by him. I think that's a wonderfully political statement because he knows there's not a majority in the Iraqi parliament for that vote, or he would have to work very hard to get it, and so he won't. He won't expend the political capital, especially against the radical Shia forces of Muqtada al-Sadr in Baghdad, to push that. So there's going to be, I think, a fudge running up to December 2011. The chair of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mullen, has already said some weeks ago that the deadline was fast approaching when a decision would have to be made. I think it's been made very clear by him that he won't let any substantial number of American troops be in Iraq without the legal covering that a new Status of Forces Agreement would need to give them, i.e. immunity, trial in American courts, not in Iraqi courts, and things like that. So I think what will happen is certainly plans have already been made by the State Department to hire a kind of contracting security force of several thousand to protect the remaining American diplomats. And I think that will be the fudge that will kick the can down the road, that there will be contractors continuing to train the Iraqi army. There will be security guards for American diplomats, but there won't be much else. Now, I think this leaves us straight off with the question, how capable is the Iraqi military? Can the Iraqi military stop Iraq heading back into that violent internecine conflict that ripped the country apart from 2005 to 2007? And I think the first good news headline is yes. I think it is. I think both the Iraqi government, but more importantly, the US government has pumped billions of dollars into reconstituting the army after its disbanding in 2003. We have 250,000 people in the, working for the Ministry of Defense, a whopping great 410,000 people working for the Ministry of Interior, and I think since American troops have taken a back role, they've proved more than able to keep a fairly rough and ready level of stability across the country. There are problems, I think, with the profound politicization of the armed forces and the intelligence services we'll get onto, but I think broadly they can keep the country together. Now, the second piece of good news, I think, is the third set of national elections held on the 7th of March 2010, that went off quite well. I think we had a turnout of 64%, which would certainly make a British Prime Minister happy, and an American President, I would have thought. And you had 4 competing coalitions fighting tooth and nail for the votes of the population. Now, as we know, I think, and that's as far as the good news story goes, I'm afraid, as we know that the Iraqi electorate, in their wisdom, delivered a very fractured vote. Most importantly, in terms of votes and seats, Prime Minister Maliki's State of Law Alliance came second. I could give you the 2,797,000 votes they got, but more importantly, they got 89 seats. And IISS, a previous incumbent Prime Minister, got 91 seats. So what we have is a dead heat almost in a parliament that has 325 seats. And I think this highlights 2 major problems. There was a great deal of distrust coming out of the electoral campaign, with all parties very worried about who would become Prime Minister. And they were worried about who would become Prime Minister for the first reason that Nuri al-Maliki, since his appointment in 2006, had developed a great deal of power, had concentrated a great deal of military power in his own hands. So there was a kind of back to the future fear haunting Baghdad that if Nuri al-Maliki were to become Prime Minister, we may be heading towards some form of dictatorship. But the second fear undermining negotiations for government of national unity was the massive vote that Ayad Allawi got. Ayad Allawi stitched together a coalition of small parties that broadly, we could simplify this, but that broadly were very successful in mobilizing the minority Sunni community's votes, especially above Baghdad, between Baghdad and the Kurdish regional government. And so that delivered certainly a massive and a surprisingly large vote to his coalition, the Iraqi coalition, but it also delivered something much more worrying for the post-regime change order, that the Sunni vote could be mobilized to renegotiate the settlement, to bring in those groupings and indeed that section of the population that were pushed out after 2003. So these 2 fears, almost a revolutionary renegotiation of politics, but more importantly, the spectre of Nuri al-Maliki as dictator, led to 8 months of stasis, 8 months where the politicians went back and forward, brinkmanship, allegations of both corruption and intimidation, and then finally, Jalal Talabani was chosen as president, voted in by the parliament, and he proposed that Nuri al-Maliki would again become prime minister. But then again, it took numerous months before Nuri al-Maliki even started to name his cabinet as negotiations went on. And again, I said I wouldn't give you any good news, but let me give you one more piece of good news. I think the cabinet, although an incredible hodgepodge of competing, mutually loathing parties, has actually done something quite interesting. It's brought in those people represented by IISS coalition, those people who were alienated, and let's be frank, those people who were the bedrock of the insurgency from 2003 to 2007, it's brought them into politics, and IISS coalition have been given some fairly powerful ministries, specifically the Ministry for Provincial Affairs, and much more importantly, the Ministry of Finance. So if this cabinet unfolded well, if this cabinet managed to function, then those people who had deployed violence against the state, those people who had been alienated by the post-regime change order, could be tied back into the state with state resources being directed to their communities in Baghdad and in the northwest, and they getting something for their vote. So that's potentially, after that 8 months of horse trading, anger, and inefficiency, that could be a potential upside. But I think there's also a great deal of problems before we get to that payoff for electoral politics. And the first one is violence. Now, I think Iraqi analysts used to be divided between those who are pessimistic and those who are optimistic. And I spent many years in 2003, at least 2007 or 8, being very pessimistic. But I can give you another optimistic scenario. If we look at the statistics, violence in Iraq actually peaked in October 2006, when 3,709 civilians were murdered. Conjure with that figure, if you will. In 1 month, nearly 4,000 innocent civilians were murdered for no other reason but being in the wrong place at the wrong time or having the wrong surname. Clearly, in 2006 and into 2007, Iraq was in the midst of a very bloody civil war. Now, if we then look at what's happening today, you could argue, from any other perspective, the 356 people that were killed in May and 285 people that were killed in April is a pretty bad thing. But compared to the horrendous carnage Iraq has gone through in recent memory, you can see that I think violence has gone rapidly down and has plateaued at that level. Roughly about 7 people a day are murdered across Iraq, which again is horrible, but not as horrendous as where Iraq's been. And I think you can also argue more intriguingly, analytically, those people are being killed for very specific reasons. Violence in Iraq has moved from the wholesale to the retail, from the wholesale slaughter of innocent civilians to the retail-focused assassinations. Most people who are murdered in Iraq today are killed with silenced weapons, these so-called sticky bombs, or triggered car bombs. They're killed because they've been targeted specifically as individuals. So what we have now is a very political and fairly precise campaign of assassinations unfolding across Iraq and specifically in Baghdad. And some more figures to blind you with science. In March, there were 31 of these assassinations, and in April, 44. Now, I think that the intriguing question for the future of Iraq, my rather ambitious title, is who's killing these people and why? And if you break those figures down, you find clearly that there are still politicians, mid-level kind of street politicians, neighborhood politicians being murdered. But the vast majority of people being murdered are state employees, senior police people, intelligence operatives, senior law and order people. And I think you could argue they're being murdered sometimes by Al-Qaeda. The head of the Debathification Committee, a guy called Al-Lami, was very effectively murdered in May, and that was blamed on Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. But also by Muqtada al-Sadr's radical forces, who are also targeting American forces, but I think much more sinisterly by forces within government. The people being murdered at the moment are being murdered in an attempt to shape the terrain of future politics. Key operatives within sensitive areas of the security system are being murdered to allow political possibilities. And we'll get to what those may be. And I think that brings us rather neatly on to the figure of Nuri al-Maliki, the Prime Minister. When Nuri al-Maliki was appointed in 2006, after another very long negotiation to form a coalition government, he was appointed simply because no one had heard of him. That the politicians had driven themselves into complete fatigue. The Americans, it was then, it's how long ago it was, Secretary of State Rice and Foreign Minister Jack Straw from London, if anyone can cast their minds back that far and remember those two individuals, who flew into Baghdad to demand that the Iraqi politicians pick a prime minister. And the man they picked was seen to be a political non-entity. And in traveling back and forward to Iraq since then, in 2006 and then in 2007, everyone was talking about Maliki's very short tenure. This man was going to be removed. He was a political lightweight. He was going to be removed either by a parliamentary vote of no confidence. But he not only survived after the charge of the Knights in March, April 2008, the sending of his army down to Basra, he triumphed. He triumphed through, and you can see the basis of his triumph through the English translation of his political coalition, the state of law. He triumphed through, you could argue, riding on the American military and General Petraeus' coattails, but he triumphed through imposing law and order onto Iraq, basically through taking credit for the ending of the civil war. And I think he got, in the March 2010 elections, he got the largest individual vote, the largest amount of people voting for him singularly in one constituency of any other politician in Iraq. So there was a great deal of both relief, gratitude, and admiration that out of this carnage had ridden, I hate to say this, but yet another Iraqi strongman. And that strongman after 2008 did what strongmen have done, I think, in Middle Eastern politics, especially in Iraqi politics, for the last 50 or 60 years. He started slowly to concentrate in his hands the levers of power, and specifically the military levers of power. He set up something called operations centers in flashpoints across Iraq, basically centers to coordinate both the police and the army and the intelligence services in different provinces in Baghdad and then across the country. That now means that in these 9 operation centers, he has appointed one of his own generals, someone tied to him through relationships of patronage and personal loyalty, to control all the security forces in that area. He's used the office of the commander-in-chief then to politicize the army, to sack generals he didn't think were loyal to him. And I think even more worrying than that, he's then taken the special forces, the anti-terrorism, the National Counter-Terrorism Force, 6,000 men that are considered to be some of the best trained and organized in the Middle East, trained by American special forces. He's taken them, removed them from parliamentary oversight from the Ministry of Defense or the Ministry of Interior, and put them under his own direct control. These 6,000 men now have the nickname the Jaish al-Maliki, mimicking the Jaish al-Mahdi of Muqtada al-Sadr, because they're seen as his dirty squad, his militia, if you want, sent to do sensitive issues of arresting political figures, but also sent to do the repeated rumors in Baghdad, a lot more sinister things. This National Counterterrorism Force now has intelligence cells and prisons in every one of Iraq's provinces in the south and center of the country. It's Maliki's vehicle, I think. And if you want to see some public evidence of where Maliki may be driving Iraqi politics, look at how he greeted the first electoral tally of the votes after the election in March 2010. This result, he said, will not stand. Now, you could argue this is perfectly well. This is politics. This is an Iraqi politician challenging the veracity of the electoral count, alleging fraud, and then taking it to the court system. The fact that he issued this statement, this result will not stand, in his role as commander-in-chief, sends a chill down my spine for the future of Iraqi politics, if not yours. So at this stage, I think we've got a mixed bag. I think we've got an Iraqi military and the Iraqi intelligence services that clearly, I think, have the indigenous capacity to hold the country together. We're not heading back to civil war. I think we have an Iraqi electoral system that threw up a very fractured vote, which basically brought 2 very different coalitions, Nuri al-Maliki's state of law and Ayad al-Awa's Iraqiyya, to the kind of finishing line almost in a neck-and-neck race, which then gave rise to a government of national unity. That, in itself, you could argue, in a country that's staggering out of civil war, is a compromise that may stop a return to violence. But on the very negative side, I think, you've got a ruling elite that deeply mistrusts each other. doesn't recognize if there were any rules of the democratic game, and then seeks to transgress them, seeks to break them, seeks to maximize their power. And you've got a prime minister who, although he would vehemently disagree if he was in a room, who I would argue has a fairly tenuous grip on the democratic principles of government. And we see that in the centralization of power, his personal direct grip over the military and the intelligence services, and his use of those as a personal vehicle for power aggrandizement, but also his statements. This electoral result won't stand. This country needs more respect. The media is, I think he said, too free. So you have, I think, the makings, I think more than the makings, the first and second steps of one individual moving towards solidifying his grip over the levers of power, personified by his ability to take the independent electoral commission that you could argue oversaw a free and fair election in March 2010 and bring that electoral commission into the control of the Prime Minister's office. Now, I think that's all very depressing, but you could say, especially sitting here in Manama, how did the Arab Spring come to Baghdad? And I think it was quite fascinating. There were a few little riots, if a riot can be little, some disturbances in Diwaniyah in the south on the 3rd of February. On the 4th and 5th of February, this had an immediate response from the Prime Minister, who firstly cut his wages. We don't know how much his wages are, because they're not public, but cut his wages in half. So with a few riots in the south of Iraq, the Prime Minister, listening to public opinion, says, I'll only take half my wages, and then he let it be known through his press spokesman that he wouldn't run for a third term. But then the protests got more and more, firstly in Baghdad around Valentine's Day on the 14th of February, then a so-called Day of Rage on the 25th of February, with Iraqis demonstrating in Tahrir Square and Freedom Square in downtown Baghdad. And what are they demonstrating for? Well, they can't, ironically, be calling for democracy because of all its faults. Iraq is a rough and ready democracy. And they can't be calling for regime change, removal of the Prime Minister who'd only just been re-elected by Parliament. It's indicative of the problems that Iraq faces. What they were demanding, thank God, things that we would take for granted either in Manama and London, electricity. That the electricity system in Iraq is absolutely dreadful. The government promises 12 hours of electricity a day, which, as you can imagine, in the middle of summer is clearly not enough to keep the population functioning, and at best delivers between 4 and 6 hours a day, and that is at the center of the country. Power cuts, the breaking down of air conditioning, the lack of fans, the lack of refrigeration is commonplace for every Iraqi who can't afford their own generator. And they were calling for employment. Unemployment and underemployment affects probably half the adult population in Iraq. So there are profound problems that Iraq was dealing with. And intriguingly, it wasn't in Baghdad, but it was up in the Kurdish regional government in Sulaymaniyah and then in Erbil that these demonstrations turned violent and that people were killed through automatic weapons fire as they tried to attack the party headquarters of the Kurdistan Democratic Party, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. And you could think, why Kurdistan? Why the Kurdish regional government? This beacon of so-called democracy and transparency, heralded by my own government, the British government, and by the United States government on occasion as being the beacon that could lead Iraq to a better future. Well, if you look especially at the Kurdistan Democratic Party and its aged leader, Masoud Barzani, we have something that is comparable, I would suspect, to a quasi-democracy, to Tunisia or Egypt before the Arab Spring. Very thick red lines around political demonstrations. That the Islamists up in the KRG who have any ability to mobilize mass support are heavily suppressed. And more than that, sustained rumors of family-driven corruption across the whole of the economy. And the economy, although heavily invested in by Turkey and with great potential in oil and gas, isn't providing the employment opportunities that the population need, hence still a great deal of migration from Iraqi Kurdistan to Europe. And so I think what this in the round suggests is the Arab Spring, even in Kurdistan, and especially in Baghdad, didn't deliver the kind of regime-shaking violence or instability we've seen elsewhere. But what it highlighted, I think, is a mismatch between three things. Firstly, 64% of the electorate did indeed in 2010 turn out to vote. And they voted, I think, in effect, to deliver a government of national unity. But that electorate is deeply alienated from a ruling elite that can't, what's this now, 8 years after regime change, even deliver electricity to its population, let alone sustainable rates of economic growth that drive the economy forward. And this ruling elite sit on what are still, I think, the world's largest undeveloped oil reserves. And there's been a great deal of publicity about the bidding rounds that have given development contracts to large multinational companies. So we have a mismatch between a democratic system, rough and ready, and a government that cannot yet, and I suspect for quite a few years to come, deliver meaningful economic development, a meaningful level of comfort and government services to its population. And behind that, I think we do have a profound question about the commitment of that unpopular ruling elite to democracy. Nuri al-Maliki has gone out of his way to monopolize, personalize, and tie to his office, specifically the commanding heights of the intelligence service and the army. So I think the good news story is, to some extent, Iraq, after a regime change and civil war, isn't heading back into all-out carnage. The bad news, I think, is that its ruling elite and its governmental institutions aren't working, and barring the military, which works well enough to keep violence to a plateau level of 200 people a month being murdered. And I think in the long run, that poses profound problems for the future of Iraq. I think Iraq's future won't be back in civil war. I don't think it will be inter-communal conflict, but it may well be a return to either a dictatorship or a quasi-dictatorship where those people's votes, hard-won through blood and treasure, are not recognized in the final election of the Prime Minister. Thank you very much.
Well, we don't often get rounds of applause immediately after a talk, so Toby, I think that demonstrates how fantastic that synopsis was in a short space of time. I think you've painted a picture of Iraq that is now at least stable, if not built on politically solid foundations, and a future where questions of governance, corruption, and economic development are still very much in question. To coin a phrase, I'll, of course, abuse my position to post the first question. Maybe change tack slightly and go into issues that we ourselves were discussing yesterday, and perhaps touching on the Arab Spring. Now, of course, you mentioned the pull down of forces from Iraq, and of course we have now notification of the drawdown of forces from Afghanistan. If we consider that huge withdrawal of a US presence in the region, and if we also consider the Arab Spring, and if we consider still the unknown unknowns, for example, the future of Syria, and therefore the bearing on other strategic alliances in the region with other large powers, I wonder how you see in the next 3, 4, 5 years, of course, with coming from Iraq's perspective, the strategic balance of military power in the region, or at least the perception of being able to project some kind of power in the region from its larger neighbor.
Yeah, it's an excellent and a suitably difficult question, so I'm not ready to thank you for it. But before I came to Manama, I had a series of discussions at a very high level with senior US military figures. And of course, like all of us, they're wrestling to understand what the Arab Spring means for the US presence in the region. And they are, I think, clearly their worry about Iran never goes away, but they're also worried about a newly or an increasingly assertive Saudi foreign policy and instability that runs now from Tunisia, Libya, Syria, and through the region. And I think, and this is work in progress, and I'll present it with no more coherence than that, is what they're grappling with is somehow dividing the region into two spheres of influence for American power projection. And that American military power projection in this area of the Middle East, in the Gulf, remains, I think, very status quo orientated and very much the same, that they will put their arms around Riyadh, Manama, the Emirates, and say, we're here for you, and we're still here to guarantee your security against external aggressors. And this is a State Department, Defense Department tension, I suppose, where Hillary Clinton and her diplomats may quite rightly and justifiably bring up and critique domestic power structures, domestic state-society relations. The Department of Defense is very much in the game of reassuring the Gulf Arab states that they are there to counter the threat of Iran. You then flip over to the more populous, the Mashreq and the Maghreb areas of the Middle East, and clearly the United States is no longer a status quo power. Played, I think, a key and largely unreported role in easing Mubarak out of power, was dragged into an incredibly ill-thought-out intervention in Libya, and to be frank, is still making its mind up about what to do in Syria, but probably will not do a great deal because it can't. So Mark's exactly right. What President Obama's policy towards the region is, or towards the wider Islamic world, is to recalibrate and rebalance the US's military presence in the region, to pull its troops out of Iraq, and now very clearly with that recent speech, to downgrade and slowly pull its troops out of Afghanistan. But then in doing that, to revisit some fairly stable and traditional military alliances, especially in the Gulf region, to focus on the threat from Iran and to give unambiguous security guarantees to its long-term allies on the Arab side of the Gulf. So I think that's its issue. Now, what we were discussing at great length yesterday is what this means for Iran. And I think coming to an IISS Voices pieces on the website soon, something to look out to, I think is a rather amusing, should we say, contradictory or schizophrenic approach of the government in Tehran to the Arab Spring. To begin with, they were cheering it, apparently unaware of the very clear comparator between the Green Movement that they just violently suppressed in Tehran and what was happening on the streets of Arab capitals. And then, of course, when it started, not only in their mind to look as an excuse for US military intervention or international community intervention, NATO intervention in Libya, they started critiquing it, of course, and then it rolled up to the doorstep of their only Arab ally in the region, Syria. They were vociferously against it. Now, I've seen fairly sustained indications that the Iranians have support the Syrian regime with weapons, but as yet I've seen no proof of personnel, although there are a lot of rumors about. I think I actually personally think the Syrian regime will probably get through this and survive, but if it doesn't, if Tehran loses Damascus as its main overt ally, I think there's a lot of politicians in Baghdad who are worried that the heavy hand of Tehran's fraternity and friendship will be less than subtly placed on their shoulders as there's an even greater attempt to turn them into a regional ally, if not vassal state.
So I don't see many hands being raised. There's one.
Hi, good afternoon. Great presentation. I was interested in hearing your views about Maliki's and Muqtada Sadr's relation and how is that going to evolve?
It's a great question because of the tensions and hypocrisy involved, I suppose. So the question is basically the Prime Minister, Nuri al-Maliki's relationship with what the New York Times likes to call the firebrand cleric Muqtada al-Sadr. And of course, when Maliki became Prime Minister in 2006, it was explicitly because he gained the support of the Sadrists in Parliament and the Sadrists within the broader United Iraqi Alliance that they were both members of. And in doing so, it's quite clear that through 2006 and into 2007, Maliki gave the Sadrists a fairly wide space, almost carte blanche, to do what they wanted in Baghdad, which was, let's be frank, religiously cleanse Baghdad to pursue a civil war. And I know senior American military personnel were very frustrated, especially in 2006, by the no-lift list that the Prime Minister had. Senior Sadrists they couldn't arrest without his explicit permission. But then, of course, this all changes in 2008 when the Sadrists, it now looks, shifted their alliance to back Ahmed Shalaba's attempt to get rid of Nuri al-Maliki. There was a fairly well-developed plot to trigger political unrest across the country to be in time with a vote of no confidence against Maliki in Parliament, and that triggered the charge of the Knights, the removal of Muqtada al-Sadr's militia in Basra, and this kind of great military show of force that is the basis to Maliki's current power base. Now, that was an incredibly traumatic moment for the Sadrists for a series of reasons. Firstly, as Maliki moved the Iraqi army down the country towards Basra, behind it were Iraqi intelligence services lifting Sadrists and breaking their ability to mobilize for the up-and-coming provincial elections. Secondly, when they got to Basra, they broke the power of the militia, and the population of Basra expressed, I think, a fairly widespread relief that a militia that had denigrated into a kind of a collective thuggery and corruption had been removed, and then that moved slowly to the breaking of Muqtada al-Sadr's militia's hold on Baghdad. Now then we go into the election campaigns of 2010, and Sadr is vociferously against Maliki. This is what I love about Iraqi politics. They're completely unpredictable. And he joins the Islamic Supreme Council for Iraq, Iran's main ally in Baghdad. So you have this electoral coalition which is as close to Tehran as possible. Tehran then changes its mind after the election, and they didn't particularly like Nuri al-Maliki. They thought he was a threat. He was comparatively autonomous, and they saw, I suppose, as I did, a dictator in the making. But then after the election, a greater threat rose up. Alawi's mobilization of the Sunnis in an attempt of undermining the dominance of Shia Islamist parties. And so they figuratively and possibly literally, for what I know, took Muqtada al-Sadr by the scruff of the neck and said, "You will support Maliki's re-election as Prime Minister." And I don't know how good your Arabic is, but if you go to Muqtada al-Sadr's website, there's a marvelous, this was, I think, November 2010, there's a marvelous edict to his supporters where basically he says, "Sorry, I didn't want to do this, but I had no choice." And it's a clear reference to the pressure he was under, I think, by Tehran to join in backing Nuri al-Maliki. Now, that backing has been solidified. The price of that backing was the release of a lot of Sadr's people from prison. And I think, again, going back to comparisons with 2006, though not as in such dire terms, you see the reassertion of Muqtada al-Sadr's malicious capacity on the ground. So Sadr's come back into a rough and ready alliance with Maliki, and that's benefited him in terms of his ability to operate on the ground in Iraq. What that means for Iraqi law and order, I think, is very worrying. We've seen increasing attacks on US military personnel and bases, so the Sadrists can claim they drove, with Iranian support, America out of the country. And I think that's very worrying for law and order. My hunch is, though, my analytical hunch, if you can say that, is that the Iraqi military, as controlled by Maliki, is much, much stronger than the Sadrists. And when he no longer needs them politically, he can do what he did to them in 2008, which is quite quickly dispose of them. But that isn't reassuring to those populations of Baghdad that have suffered under the Sadrist militia and see that militia, as we speak, reconstituting its ability. And it's actually not very comfortable for Admiral Mullen, the chair of the Joint Chiefs, who desperately wants to renegotiate a new Status of Forces agreement, and the Sadrists are the largest party in Parliament and can and will, I suspect, block that going through Parliament.
So we have two fingers from Mike, and then we'll come straight over to you.
Yeah, Toby, thanks a lot. During your actually prepared remarks, you didn't talk at all about the role Iran, the GCC, and the other neighboring states will have on the future of Iraq. Although in some of the questions here, you've touched on Iran and possibly, you know, if the Damascus government falls, what that might do to the Baghdad-Tehran relationship. But what about the GCC? If the Sunnis become increasingly marginalized, do you see greater involvement or a greater role for the Saudis and other GCC members?
I think I'm right in saying Saudi Arabia is the only country not to have an embassy still in Baghdad, and I could be corrected on that, but I'll make the broader point that the relations between Baghdad and Riyadh are still absolutely dreadful. That the Saudi government has never forgiven Nuri al-Maliki for allowing the civil war and the ethnic, or the religious, the Sunni cleansing of Baghdad. And so there's a long way to go. And to a certain extent, that keeps Saudi Arabia peripheral from influencing Iraqi politics. So I think in that sense, the biggest player in the Gulf, on the Arab side of the Gulf, is marginalized. Other GCC states, the Emirates, especially Kuwait, have put quite a lot of effort into slowly rejuvenating their relationship with Baghdad, but there's the plans for the Kuwait to build this new port down on the tiny next to the tiny Iraqi seaboard have caused problems, and I think that continuing, I'd say, historic problem with the Kuwaiti-Iraqi border will continue to flare up, and let's face it, Kuwaitis aren't very popular in Iraqi popular opinion, so that's a problem. So I think limited rapprochement with the UAE playing a more role, and of course massive investment from the Gulf into Iraq and the Gulf and the Emirates, I suspect, is the natural platform from which to do that. So the Emirates as the investment vehicle geographically, technically, and I suspect also financially for rejuvenating Iraq and the great potential it has. And of course the elephant in the room of all this is Iran. It shows what many years of exile does to politicians, especially when they're lucky or unlucky enough to be brought back by the Americans and placed in power. From the president of Iraq down, with notable exceptions, the vast majority of Iraq's ruling elite are deeply integrated into the power structures of Iran. The exception, obviously, is Ayatollah Alawi, and when he says the Iranians worked very hard to make sure I wasn't going to become prime minister, I think he has a point. So you have a very symbiotic relationship between large numbers of the Kurdish and Shia Arab ruling elite in Baghdad and their comrades in Tehran. But that said, because the Iraqi population is both very Arab and very Iraqi nationalist, the vast majority of them obviously aren't Kurds, the close symbiotic relationship between Iraq's ruling elite and Tehran has to be mediated in public relations terms. And I think ISKI, the Amar Hakim's party, the Supreme Council, has clearly the longest running relationship with Tehran, was set up in Tehran in 1982 as a vehicle for Iranian foreign policy in Iraq. And I think it's no coincidence that they did incredibly poorly in the last national elections. That the politics that ISKI was selling to the Iraqi electorate, sectarian, deeply religious, and more or less aligned to Tehran, were voted out. So I think that's what stops Iranian influence blossoming in a comparable way to Syria in Iraq, public antipathy towards their neighbor.
We have one question from Sagar, and then we head east for another question. Can I just ask as well if everybody asking a question just identifies themselves? Nothing else for the assistance of our rapporteurs.
Sagar Al-Khalifa. Well, Doctor, you're talking about the future of Iraq, which means that you're doing some kind of a forecasting. So I want to just ask a question, a theoretical, more of a question. Just recently, I'm not sure if you know him, Bueno de Mosquito. He's a professor in New York University. He's assuming and forecasting that Syria's regime is going to fall based on his model, which says that if he's not able to provide to the elite as he used to, he will definitely not succeed. So when I try to apply this model to Iraq, I can see that basically right now Iraq is in the middle, and they have a choice to make, either to basically provide to the elite and further alienate the electorate from the ruling parties, or to introduce reform, good development in a way, tap into that oil reserves and move, towards prosperity. But the way you forecasted that they will choose, they might have. It seems like most likely they will go towards further alienation. With regards to this model, can I just have some of your thoughts on this, please?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I know the good professor's work, and I, like him, claim to be a political scientist, but unlike him, I'm left uneasy with the rigidity of his models and somewhat skeptical about their ability to predict. Now, given what this region's going through and has been through over the last few months, that may seem to be a fairly rash statement, but we've had an incredibly stable set of regimes going forward from the 70s onwards, some of the most stable in the world. And to my mind, at least, three regimes have suffered regime change if the president of Yemen doesn't come back from his healthcare in Saudi Arabia. Now, that's a small number, and I think if you compare Tunisia to Egypt, the drivers behind both were fairly different, or you could explain both of them as soft coups, where the security establishment, especially in Egypt and the military, looks at their leader and says, right, we'll ditch him in order to survive. So popular discontent had a role to play, but I think the danger of us generalizing from 2 or 3 examples to the region as a whole would leave me very worried, which is why I do think there's a lot more life in the Syrian regime. So if we take that as the basis to this, I think regimes can stumble through on a package of patronage, ideology, and repression for a great deal of time, which is why I think the predictions of his model, I mean, you can say all regimes will fall and dictatorial regimes will fall more quickly, but then don't put a time on it and you're not going to look silly when your model doesn't deliver. So I think when faced with regime collapse and civil war, what the United States did, fairly understandably, but problematically, was pump a massive amount of money into reconstituting the Iraqi state's military capacity. And although Paul Bremer and George W. Bush had a huge reformist agenda in terms of pushing the state out of the economy, the percentage of Iraqis now employed by the state, I think, is now almost exactly the same as it was under Saddam Hussein. So again, you've got a state with a very large army, an increasingly effective politicized and personalized intelligence service that is employing as many people as it can. It's in deficit at the moment, though one assumes if it pumps more, if it reaches even close to its output in terms of oil, its finances will look healthier. So I think I know what the Iraqi ruling regime are thinking is, if we can hold on long enough, the oil will allow us, in a very straightforwardly rentier fashion, to buy our population off and demobilize them and build a strong enough security service that they won't pose a problem. And to be frank, that model has worked pretty well, with a couple of hiccups in Iraq's history and in the wider region. So I think they will continue, as you said, to alienate their population and to look after the interests of this very divided elite, with the hope that the oil payday will buy them longevity over the medium term. And I suspect, although it's a horrible outcome, which leads a lot of the Iraqi population impoverished in the near term, unemployed and very angry, it's not such a reckless gamble for Nuri al-Maliki and those around him.
Nadeem Mojtaba, Directors Council. Toby, would like you to summarize 10 years experience. What did we gain out of this Iraq experiment? Spent $1 trillion, started with a dictator, ending up with more or less a dictator, and in between, lots of killing, sectarian violence, ethnic cleansing. What's the pluses and minuses? Could we have achieved this or better without spending money harming as many people as we did?
I think it's an excellent question, and we at the Institute are now working on a project about Afghanistan, and I've just finished the chapter in it on the politics and institutional capacity building in Afghanistan as well. And I think both of them delivered, to me at least, incredibly sobering lessons that would say to me that you'd have to be incredibly modest about external intervention into a domestic sphere you don't understand, you won't be welcome in, and you probably won't be able to, beyond the army, you won't be able to reconstitute civilian state capacity over the time span you've got. Now that would be, in one line would be my headlines, and then I look over my shoulder and what is President Sarkozy and our own Prime Minister Cameron doing in Libya? They're invading or they're using military action against the least institutionalized state, barring Yemen possibly, in the whole of the Middle East. Now, if I was to draw a list of countries of my tip top for successful regime change and invasions, I start with the most institutionalized, and I'd work my way down because of the experiences of 2003, 2011, all the experiences in Afghanistan. And what they've done is flipped it around the other side. So the short answer would be the politicians of Europe are still very interventionist, and I don't think have learned any of the lessons of Iraq or Afghanistan. The longer term answer would be looking at Iraq, and I think Afghanistan as well, what the US military has proved to be very, very good at doing after some hiccups in Iraq 2003, 2005, 6, is building indigenous military capacity. Basically, the Iraqi army and the Afghan army was stood up almost from scratch, especially in the Afghan case, and I suspect, given the best part of a decade and an awful lot of money, they can do that. You then go back and compare the institutional capacity of the Afghan state and the Iraqi state, and it's a hugely unfair comparison. I'll put that on the table first, because the Afghan state, although there was, I think, 450,000 civil servants miraculously still on the payroll when regime change happened, the Afghan state has always had a very mediating role with society. Its presence within Afghan society has been tolerated at best, and there isn't a very wide presence. Whereas, as we know, the Iraqi state has benefited from massive injections of oil wealth and capacity building, both for good and ill. It won a United Nations award for its literacy campaigns, and also slaughtered tens of thousands of its population on the Great Balance of things, but it was a strong state. Now, what happened, obviously, under sanctions from 1990 through to 2003, that state atrophied. But a lot of the work I did in 2008 was looking at how that state reconstituted itself. And the reconstitution of the Iraqi ministries and their presence in Iraqi society was largely indigenous. So I did a lot of research in Baghdad before regime change, and interviewing well-trained but very senior in terms of both age and position civil servants, a lot of them educated in Britain before sanctions. And then I came back in 2008, would walk into the same ministries and be greeted by the same civil servants. Like, where have you been? You were here, how many, 5, 6 years ago? We've been here. And they reconstituted the state. Now, I think that I celebrate their ingenuity and tenacity. On a wing and a prayer, and with baling wire and sticky tape, they reconstituted their state. But the downside of that, the negative conclusions, is the billions of dollars, literally the billions of dollars spent in good intent by the United States government in trying to help that process were largely irrelevant. And then if we take that model, the indigenous reconstitution of the Iraqi state, and we take it to Afghanistan, we've got a problem, because the state, I suspect, will find it very difficult to reconstitute. And if it does reconstitute, it won't be the kind of omnipresent, institutionally strong state that counterinsurgency doctrine needs to succeed. So I think the lessons from Iraq in terms of building indigenous military capacity are, in favor of the current US, or the US policy before President Obama's second Afghan speech, but they pose profound questions about the type of state that can be built exogenously by invaders over a relatively short period of time. And I think that raises, in my mind, very depressing doubts if, and I think it's a big if the current over 100-day military campaign against the Gaddafi regime in Tripoli is successful, we're heading into a whole heap of trouble in reconstituting a very weakly institutionalized state with a population that won't stay, are already complaining that NATO aren't supporting them in the way they need, probably justifiably. So although, again, Libya is an oil-rich state, it's also a very weak state in terms of its relations with society. And I don't think the international community, and especially the US, British, NATO, have worked out after Afghanistan, as it were, how to do this better.
We haven't quite come up to 1 hour, so unless anybody wants to pose any more questions, I wouldn't mind posing one more. And maybe in doing so, drawing the Brigadier into the discussions. It was interesting when you were describing the statistics on violence in particular, how the majority, of course, seem to be politically motivated. But I'd be very interested to hear, and this is maybe where the Brigadier might be able to give us an insight as well, how many of the current attacks do you think are also stemming from organized crime? I understand that crime and politics will be, to a certain extent, intermingled, but how much of this is drug running from the east, and how do the police forces seem to be able to cope with the current threats, again, with a look to the future?
Sorry, James Baxter. I'm Managing Director of IISS, and I think we're still the largest private contractor in Iraq. And we work for a number of the oil companies, the oil majors in the south. I think what we've been seeing of late, particularly in the Basra area in the south, is an growing instance of organised crime, because basically it has become a honeypot for greater wealth. And so certainly a lot of the recent attacks, particularly against oil infrastructure, have been in part crime related. And so really that's the breadth of our analysis and our experience. But it is a growing problem, it's a growing phenomenon. I think that what we see consistently, as I think you referred to it, is the immaturity of the institutions, significant corruption, and although you've made significant comment on the armed forces, and yes, it is a success story, but the police has not been. A lot of the difficulties, the criminality, stems from the paucity of policing, particularly in the south. If I could contrast what you say is, okay, we've institution built quite well in the military, but we've failed significantly in the police.
I think I completely agree, and I think that rate, and it's the same in Afghanistan. There seems to be a much more straightforward. It's not easy, but a much more straightforward task to constitute a military force. What seems to be much more difficult is building a national police force that is both effective but also honest and has a kind of rule-governed relationship with society. The personification of, you're exactly right, the police in Baghdad, 2004-5 to 2006-7, were not only one of the main vehicles of the civil war coming out of the Ministry of Interior, were ethnically, religiously cleansing great areas of Baghdad. They were also responsible for the vast majority of kidnapping. So you had those enforcing law and order actually kidnapping people. So that's where weak government institutions and crime come face to face in a very supportive way, I suppose. When I was in Baghdad straight after regime change, and it's interesting how you could know there was a problem coming. It was that crime exploded, and it was particularly kidnapping. And it was the kidnapping both of female members of families, but also of people with money. And as you were saying, it's about resource exchange, that if you're seen to be wealthy, it's not a political, you're kidnapped basically to extort money from your family. And ironically, that indigenous Iraqi-on-Iraqi kidnapping dropped off with the surge through 2008 and has started to come back up again, which is I think the Iraqi police are much better than they were, but they're still very, very much work in progress. I think we do have a level of worrying criminality. But that said, I'd stick my neck out and say there has been progress. The crime wave that indicated the starting of the insurgency in 2003-04 to the height of the civil war, 5-6, and the decline, I think if you look at statistics, there is still police corruption, there is still police inefficiency, there is still crime, but it's not at the level that it was in the first 5 or 6 years after regime change. Now, you could argue, you could put a caveat and say yet, and we could argue that possibly the Iraqi police are on an upswing, or that poorly institutionalized and corrupt policing will be a feature of both the Iraqi and the Afghan landscape for the next decade, in which case, whatever happens politically, Iraq's still going to be a miserable place for the urban middle class who will be the engine of any growth.
Maybe time for one more question.
Hi, Samir Sami. You mentioned Kurdistan as described it as a beacon of democracy. How much does central government have influence over Kurdistan, in Kurdistan? And given Kurdistan's or Kurdish perhaps aspiration of independence, what influence do they have in the stability or otherwise of the central government?
That's an excellent question. I think if we were to map the fortunes of the Kurdish regional government, we would map it in reverse, I suspect, to the coherence of the Iraqi government in Baghdad. So from 2003 to 2006-07, the Kurdish regional government were in the apex of their strength. Basically, it was the Kurdish regional government, especially President Talabani, who wrote the Iraqi constitution, and the Iraqi constitution was written specifically to make Iraq one of the most decentralized and federalized states in the world, so the Kurdish regional government could keep the power it had amassed since 1991. Now, 2008-09, you see the resurgence of Iraqi state power and the Iraqi military coming up to the borders of Kurdistan, and you nearly come very close, I think, 2008 to a shooting war between two forces, which is why the American forces were placed between them along the so-called trigger line. Now, where are we now? I think for the Kurdish regional government, the good news story is that there have been major oil finds, a recent major gas find, and their relationships with Ankara economically through companies and parastatal companies are strong and increasing. The bad, and I'd largely say that's an economic story that they'd want to turn into a politics story. They'd want to say to the government in Ankara, we can supply you with oil and gas, you supply us with an outlet to international markets, and don't be influenced by Baghdad. And I don't think Ankara will play that game. I think Ankara will seek to balance their understandable commitments to strong centralized Iraq as a strong centralized Turkey with the economic advantages for their entrepreneurs of investing in the Kurdish regional government and getting their gas and oil. And I think there's nothing the Kurdish regional government can do about that, because their only outlet, if not via Baghdad, is via Turkey. So that said, there's been a long-running dispute that I won't go into the ups and downs of between the Kurdish regional government and Baghdad about the terms under which the Kurdish regional government can strike independent deals with oil companies and export its oil. I suspect, and I'll put that in italics if you're reading it on a screen, that that's close to being mediated. I think for a series of reasons, primarily that the KDP and the PUK, the two Kurdish parties, were partly the kingmakers for Maliki. There was a wonderful quote when a senior Kurdish politician was asked, "You hate Maliki, and you've got very good relations with Alawi. Why on earth did you back Maliki over Alawi?" And this senior politician said, "You know, if you're faced with someone who won't offer you anything and someone who will offer you everything but is lying, you take the person who's lying." So there were a series of, I don't know if that's negotiating logic, I'll defer to that, but there were a series of very explicit promises on oil and gas, especially on revenue, given to the Kurdish regional government by Maliki. And you could, I mean, there's 16 points, I think you can find them quite easily. And I suspect to some extent, on oil and gas, they'll be honoured to some extent. But in preparation for this talk, I had a very long discussion with a very senior Kurdish politician, and there's still a great deal of insecurity and anger directed towards Baghdad because they haven't been given the oil and gas autonomy. And I suspect they deeply worry that they can't bring down Maliki. And so their leverage is very limited. So if, as Hussein Shahrastani, the former Minister of Oil and now the Vice Prime Minister responsible for all matters of energy, had said, you know, if you as a company invest in Kurdistan, we're going to blacklist you, and for the Kurdish regional government, you come through Baghdad and on Baghdad's terms, or we'll stop it happening. And to some extent, I think the frustration and worries of the Kurdish regional government and senior Kurdish politicians indicate that they realize that the route out to Ankara is no solution, and there still will have to be in tortuous and dependent negotiations with Baghdad for the foreseeable future, because they're not going to get any more autonomy than they've got. The Baghdad government will seek to run all the resources from Kurdish oil and gas through Baghdad and then back out in order to keep the Kurdish regional government's autonomy limited. And if the Iraqi government, in this trade-off between its population and the ruling elite, moves more towards Mosquito's argument and gives more resources to its population, the state will increase, and the Kurdish regional government's autonomy is going to directly suffer from that, and they know that. I think the supreme confidence, if not arrogance, of 2005 has dropped into a fairly justifiable insecurity.
Toby, thank you so much for taking the time to come over here and impart your wisdom on us. We've already thanked you once, but I think everybody will join me again to give you another round of applause. Thank you everybody else for coming. I'm sure we'll be sending you more invitations over the summer, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.